Welcome to Layer the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, I'm going to be ranking the discography of King Crimson. And this is also a follow-up to the music challenge that I put out there about 8 or 9 days ago around the making of this video. The music challenge was to take a discography from a band and listen to it from beginning to end. And the band that I picked was King Crimson. And I picked King Crimson because they're a band that I was really not very familiar with their catalog. I really only knew like 1 or 2 albums from them. And it wasn't a case of like they're a band that I don't like. They're just one of these bands that for some reason I never really listened to a lot of their music. So I thought it would be fun to listen to from their first album to their most recent album and just take it all in. And for this video, I thought it would be cool, being that I realized that I really only knew 2 or 3 King Crimson albums out of their 13 albums. So I thought it would be fun for me to rank their albums. These are almost like ranking them by a first impression. You know, normally when I do rankings of albums on here, they're bands that I'm really familiar with. And the trick is always, you know, let's say a band like AC/DC or Black Sabbath. These are bands that I've been listening to since I, started getting into to music, since I was like 10 years old. So to sit back with somebody like Black Sabbath, for instance, and try to rank their albums, it's a challenge because I always think to myself, all right, and I did a ranking of the Black Sabbath albums here with my friend Darren. And I always have to think to myself, all right, am I ranking these albums how I feel today? Or do I rank them how I felt when I was 12 years old? You know, when I was 12 years old, I couldn't stop listening to Iron Man and War Pigs because it was also new to me. Now, 40 years later, 35 years later, I'm a little bit burnt out on some of those songs, so it affects my ranking of those records. So I thought it would be really, would be really interesting to rank these King Crimson albums because I have no experience with them. They're outside of 2 or 3 of them. I had never heard these records, so I pretty much I listened to everything once, all the way through, and the way I did my ranking was I started with their first album, In the Court of the Crimson King. That was my number 1, and then if something came up that was better than that, I just kept shuffling it around as I listened to the different records and kept adjusting my list with every album. And so it's kind of interesting. It's like a newbie's ranking of King Crimson because they're so new to me. And I would imagine that if I sit down with their catalog and you were to talk to me a year later after I've listened to a bunch of these albums again and taking them in more, the list would probably change a lot. But I thought it would be really cool to just see how I rank these albums as somebody who's listening to them for the first time. Going back to the challenge, this was really fun because, again, I didn't know a lot of their catalog. And King Crimson is a band that 69 was their first album. I'm not sure when their last album came out. I don't think it was really that long ago, maybe in the last 10 years or so, I think. So they span across multiple decades, and they're a very progressive, experimental band that tries and does different things. So it was interesting to sort of follow the progression through their albums, how they changed, and how everything sort of moved, and to just follow the evolution of the band. All right, so there's my thoughts on the challenge. Leave a message down below how the challenge went for you guys. I saw a lot of people that accepted the challenge, picked a band. How was it for you to go through their albums, and what was that experience like for you? For me, it was a lot of fun. And all right, so here's for the ranking. Now, when I first got into the King Crimson albums, I started with, of course, their first album, Court of the Crimson King, and that was the one I was most familiar with. I've done a video on that album. And man, the early stuff, I was listening to 2 or 3 albums a day. I was really, really digging it. Unfortunately, when I hit the 80s, the mood changed, and it became a real slog for me to get through those 80s albums. But it started picking up again with their last 2 or 3 albums. But for me, really, the 70s stuff is what really got me excited and what I really enjoyed. On a typical album ranking, I'd probably go more in depth with my picks. But again, most of these, I only listened to them once. So I'm not really going to say a whole lot, because again, I'm not super familiar with a lot of them. But all right, so here's my list. I'm going to start from number 1 too, and I'm going to work my way. Normally, I start from the bottom and go backwards. I'm going to go with my number 1. My number 1 was In the Wake of Poseidon. I really dug that. I dug the different feels and the different changes in a lot of the songs, and just the way it just sort of moved around. I just really dug it. Number 2 was In the Court of the Crimson King for me. I know that's probably number 1 for a lot of people. That has 20th Century Schizoid Man, their most recognizable song. I dug that. That was the album I was the most familiar with too. Next for me was Lark's Tongue in Aspic. I really liked that one. I really dug the 70s King Crimson stuff. You're going to see here all the 70s albums landed up in the top of my list here. It's listening to this was the fun part of the challenge, as I went sort of album to album and hearing how things evolved. And now I'm not super familiar with the history of King Crimson. I know that like Robert Fripp has been a consistent throughout the band, and for their first couple albums, the lineup sort of changed a lot. Then it sort of settled in for sort of those middle 70s records. All right, next for me was Red. That would be number 4 for me. I really liked this sort of later era of the band. I think John Wetton was on that one on bass, and I liked those eras of the band when John Wetton was singing. Number 5, Starless and Bible Black. And number 6 for me, Islands. And number 7, rounding out the albums from the 70s, was Lizard. I did sort of like I think there was a long song at the end, like a multi-part song at the end that I thought was really cool. All right, now, I did not enjoy the 80s King Crimson stuff. We're going to get to that. So the next for me is this stuff after the 80s. The Construction of Light, it came in at number 8 for me. Number 9 was Thrack. And number 10 was The Power to Believe. And these are all their last three records. I noticed that they went more. I like the heaviness of some of these albums. I think as a metalhead, there was a lot of very metal-like riffing on these. I noticed they went into way more of almost an instrumental phase here. The last album I've ranked from that era, The Power to Believe, was for the most part pretty much an instrumental record, give or take a few vocal things. And I think that's why none of these albums ranked higher for me, because I liked the 70s stuff was for me a nice mixture of experimental stuff, chopsy stuff, but there was also a lot of melody to a lot of these songs, and that's what I really loved about the 70s stuff. The lyrics were engaging, the melodies were engaging. So the last couple albums, I liked the heaviness of them and the progginess of it. And they were very tight in everything, playing-wise and performance-wise. But it just didn't grab me like the 70s stuff. The 70s stuff felt more. I just liked the chemistry in the band in the 70s, especially the last couple albums from the 70s era. All right, and then at the bottom of my list, really, these could have gone in any order. I did not like the 80s stuff. It was a real slog getting through those. It was like I hit a brick wall. I listened to the first 80s ones, and first album from the 80s, and I just felt like I couldn't even struggled to get through it. That was my highest ranked one, the one in 84, which was Discipline. Elephant, what was it called? Elephant Talk, I think it was the first song on there. I know this is sort of like the Tony Levin era of the band, and Adrian Belew, and I like Adrian Belew, I like his playing, but I just did not like a lot of the vocals on these sort of like spoken word vocal things. I did not like it. I did not like the production on those records. In coming out of the 70s stuff where I was really engaged and didn't know what was going to happen next, I was just like, really listening to these records. I loved the twists and turns and the different things that they did. Also the 70s stuff, I want to mention this too. The dynamics in the 70s stuff was so incredible. It was like orchestral, like whisper quiet to just big bombastic things. It was so cool to hear that. Something that you do not hear in modern music. Bands that play with dynamics the way King Crimson did in the 70s. That just really blew me away. You know, nowadays the loudness war sucks a lot of that out of the mixing and the mastering, but just the music in general, the way King Crimson was able to just build things. I would go from whisper quiet to exploding chaotic stuff was just absolutely great. The 80s stuff for me though, oh man, the production, I hated the production. The drums had a very like electronic type sound to them. Again, I haven't dived into the history of the band, so I can't really comment a whole lot about who was in it and why and everything, but I didn't like the production. I didn't like the vocals. They weren't catchy enough. There was some cool riffing and some cool proggish stuff, but oh man, it just felt like it took me like 2 days to go, 3 days to go through the 70s stuff. It took me like 4 or 5 to get through those 3 80s records. It was just, I wasn't looking forward to it. By the time I got into the second one, I thought, well, maybe it was just the first one I listened to. The second one then was just like, okay, this is what this is going to be like. And I was really nervous then about the last 3 records. All right, where is this going to go? And at least the 3 most recent heavy riffs and some of the things got me through that. And I did like those. But for me, it was really the 70s stuff was really where it's at. And if I revisit King Crimson, which I'm going to, and I do have some of their 70s stuff on vinyl, but I'm going to, you know, get the rest of their 70s stuff on vinyl and really dig into that a lot more because I really enjoyed that. Okay, so there you go. The King Crimson ranking. Let me know what you guys think. Again, I'm total sort of new to King Crimson here. Let me know what some of your favorite King Crimson records are. What do you guys think of the 80s King Crimson stuff? Do you like it? How about their newer stuff? You know, or is it the 70s? Are you like me, the 70s stuff? Let me know how your music challenge went with the bands that you picked. Let me know how the experience was. It was something I really enjoyed. I think I'm going to do it with some other bands. I've sort of said to myself, I want to do Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. I'm sort of in. I've been listening to a lot of experimental proggish stuff lately. I'm in the mood for that kind of stuff. I think that helped me with King Crimson. I was in this sort of avant-garde jazz and classical stuff I've been listening to, and that helped me sort of get right into this early King Crimson stuff. So let me know how your music challenge went with the bands that you selected. Let me know what you think of my ranking of the King Crimson stuff. And until we see you again, make sure you rock hard, ride free.